So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest Asian Carp Canada webinar. My name is Rebecca Schroeder, and I work on the Asian Carp program at the Invasive Species Center, and I will be your moderator today. The Invasive Species Center is a nonprofit organization that works to prevent the spread of invasive species in Canada and beyond. And at the Invasive Species Center, we work with Fisheries and Oceans Canada on our Asian Carp program, which manages the digital outreach of this program, where we provide resources, information, and education on the prevention, early detection, and response to Asian carps. Today's webinar is titled Socio-Economic Impact of the Presence of Grass Carp in the Great Lakes Basin. This webinar marks the official release of the risk assessment, and we will have statements from the collaborating organizations today. Today we will have Salim Haider from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, Mark Gaiden from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and Andreas Link from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. So I'm pleased to present our speakers today. The Acting Regional Director of Policy and Economics, Salim Haider, PhD, is located in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He has spent his 10 years with DFO in Policy and Economics. Salim's substantive role is Manager, Economics and Statistics within Policy and Economics. Prior to joining DFO, he taught economics at the University of Manitoba for 10 years and worked at the World Bank for 5. Salim was born and raised in Bangladesh. Salim loves taking on new challenging roles with a penchant on being able to move the parts of the organization forward along with the rest of the regional teams. We also have Dr. Mark Gaiden, who is the Communications Director and Legislative Liaison for the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, a U.S.-Canadian agency established by treaty to improve and perpetuate the Great Lakes fishery. Also, he is an adjunct assistant professor at the School for Environment and Sustainability, University of Michigan, and an adjunct associate professor at the Department of Fisheries and Wildlife, Michigan State University. He teaches courses in environmental and water policy and environmental politics. Last but not least, we have Andreas Link, who is the team lead of the Economics Unit and the Policy Division of Ontario's Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Before we get started with the webinar, there was a couple of items I wanted to mention. First, if you're having any technical difficulties during the webinar, please type them into the chat box, or you can email me by responding to your registration email, and I will try and resolve it for you. Second, there's a brief survey following the webinar, so if you could take a few moments to fill that out, it would be greatly appreciated. And last is that there will be time for questions following the webinar, and we will also be joined by Becky Cudmore and Dave Marson from Fisheries and Oceans Canada for a question period. So if at any time during the presentation you have a question, please type it in the question box, and I will read it out loud to our speakers, and they will do their best to answer them for you following the presentation. So to keep things moving, I will pass things along to Andreas Link from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks for organizing this, and thanks for moderating this session. I thank the other partners as well on the line. The Ministry of Natural Resources in Ontario shares the responsibility for Asian carp prevention and response with Fisheries and Oceans Canada, and our actions are guided by an agreement that's been in place since 2011. Of course, Ontario government is committed to fighting and preventing invasive species with the Invasive Species Act in Ontario. Asian carp have the potential to impact recreational and commercial fisheries in Ontario, which are worth almost $2.5 billion combined annually. But of course, you know, it's hard to put a value on what the fisheries means to Ontarians, both economically, but also socially and culturally. Preventing Asian carp and other invasive species from arriving and becoming established is critical to our fight against this growing threat. And Ontario continues to explore the value of Great Lakes fisheries to their social and economic and cultural health. Such threats or challenges as the invasive species and Asian carp pose on those values and what is important to Ontario, which is why the amount of work that is done between the three organizations. Of course, the Ontario supports the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee and then participates in a number of councils and committees, the Council of Great Lakes Agencies, Invasive Fish Task Force. Other coordinated control and response actions include environmental DNA testing, electrofishing netting, awareness and outreach with commercial fishers, and collaboration with our U.S. counterparts on Lake Erie to carry out enhanced surveillance and research. So I'm looking forward to the presentation from Salim and his work. We have worked together. He has been obviously the lead on the file, and hopefully, as Ontario improves its work on the values for the Great Lakes, we can then add to the work that Salim has done so well. Thanks again for allowing me to participate.
Thanks, Andreas. And now we can pass things over to Dr. Mark Gaiden from the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And again, I echo what Andreas said about the importance of this webinar and also of the fishery, the value of the fishery to the people of the United States and Canada. DFO and Province of Ontario, among many others, are our key partners in this. The Fishery Commission represents the binational nature of the fishery. So we look at the fishery from a regional perspective, and we do have the responsibility, among other things, to control the invasive sea lamprey, which is a poster child invader and one that motivates all of us to take invasive species very seriously, given what lamprey do and what the stakes are if we don't take care of the problem. We also help the jurisdictions work together across borders, which is very important given that there are 2 countries, 8 states, Province of Ontario, tribes, and many others who are interested in the fishery and actually have an active management role. The grass carp presents an opportunity for us at some other point to talk about the massive amount of cooperation that actually does occur. And Andreas did talk just a little bit about this already. There is coordination across borders, and we are working very hard to address collectively the grass carp problem. Why? Because aquatic invasive species, and Asian carp in particular, pose perhaps the biggest threat to the future of the Great Lakes ecosystem and its fishery. Invasive species inflict enormous harm, both economically and ecologically, to the region. The best thing to do, of course, is to keep them from coming into the system in the first place, or if they are present, to not let them become established. If we don't take that kind of action, the consequences are essentially irreversible. The more we know about the harm that invasive species pose, the more motivated we become to do something about it. And I think that's what this call is all about. So the Fishery Commission very much appreciates what Fisheries and Oceans Canada has done in this risk assessment. The Socio-Economic Risk Assessment. I very much look forward to what Dr. Hyder has to say about this work. And at the end of the call, I'll reflect a little bit about why this is so important. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Mark. And now I will pass things over to Salim.
Thank you, Rebecca. First of all, I would like to start with thanking you and thanking Invasive Species Center for organizing the webinar and for inviting us to present the study Socio-Economic Risk Assessment of the Presence of Grass Carp in the Great Lakes Basin. On behalf of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, I would also take this opportunity to express my heartfelt gratitude to Great Lakes Fishery Commission and Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources for their close collaboration, and very importantly, the entire Ecological Risk Assessment team for their continuous, unwavering support over the course of the study. And also, last but not the least, our appreciation to all the registrants for attending the webinar. Fisheries and Oceans Canada undertook this study to provide public sector resource managers in Canada and the United States with relevant economic values for major industries in the Great Lakes Basin. By providing this information, coupled with Ecological Risk Assessment, which is the foundation of the study and which was published in January 2017, Fisheries and Oceans Canada is demonstrating its critical role in supporting decision makers nationally and internationally with their grass carp prevention and eradication measures. So, without any further delay, I will now get to the study presentation. As you all understood from the title, the objective of the study are to provide estimates of economic values generated in and around the Great Lakes Basin by sectors predicted to be impacted. And finally, to provide the best estimates possible of the socio-economic risk of the presence of grass carp in the Great Lakes Basin, following the scenarios generated by the biological risk assessment. Before I get to the main part of my presentation, which is baseline section and risk assessment, I would like to present some information very briefly on the Great Lakes just to highlight the significance of the area for Canada and the United States. Probably some or all of you know this information, are aware of this information. These are very brief. Of the total 244 and 160 square kilometer of surface area of the Great Lakes, United States account for 64% for a total of 167,000 square kilometer, and Canadian province of Ontario accounts for 36% for a total of 87,500 square kilometer. The Great Lakes hold 20% of the world's fresh surface water and 95% of North America's fresh surface water. The Great Lakes contain more than 30,000 islands. Of the total size of the Great Lakes Basin, the Great Lakes and their connecting channels make up a third of this area. Forests account for 40% and agriculture account for about a quarter of basin area. The Great Lakes provide drinking water and support the lives of approximately 40 million people, roughly 10% of the US population and over 30% of the Canadian population. The Great Lakes support 3,500 species of plants, animals, including over 170 fish species. 20 species of fish and 11 species of mollusks are presently protected under Canadian Species at Risk Act and or Ontario Endangered Species Act. In the United States, the Endangered Species Act lists 3 species of mollusks as endangered. Now I will get to the methodology portion of the study. I will briefly talk about some main aspects, some critical aspects of the methodology. First of all, the methodology used in the study is the total valuation methods. The reason for this methodology or the utilization of the valuation of this methodology are a few. First of all, it is defined as the sum of benefits involved and can be used to assess economic benefit qualitatively or quantitatively or both. Secondly, it allows for a robust measurement and comparison of values and presents these values in terms that people are familiar with or people understand. Thirdly, it is both logical and comprehensive due to its foundation in microeconomic theory. And finally, since total economic valuation is followed by economists in valuing environmental goods and services, the relevant literature can be used consistently using this framework. The baseline for the study is 2014, which is the same as binational ecological risk assessment, as that study provided the foundation of the study. The study area came from ecological risk assessment, and it comprises Canadian and US side of the Great Lakes Basin. Of the major activities currently occurring in and around the Great Lakes Basin, based on the reports, following the reports of ecological risk assessment and subsequently our close collaboration with the entire team, ecological risk assessment team, the study recognized that the presence of grass carp may impact commercial fishing, recreational boating, recreational hunting, and the beaches and lakefront users. Therefore, the scope of the study was limited to those activities. Other activities, for example, water use, oil and gas, commercial navigations, were predicted to have negligible or no impact by the presence of grass carp, and therefore we excluded that from our discussion in the study. The values reported in the study are all in US dollar. In addition to the quantitative part of the study also qualitatively analyzed ecosystem services, option value, research value, existence value, bequest value as part of the total economic valuation, as we mentioned in the when we talked about total economic valuation. It can incorporate both qualitative and quantitative part of the valuation. Now, in order to estimate the economic value of the Great Lakes Basin and the risk should grass carp establish in those lakes, the study includes both expenditure at market value and consumer surplus. Consumer surplus was added because expenditure that we see in the market does not include consumer surplus, which is also generated by the activities in the Great Lakes area, so that it captures the total value generated in the Great Lakes Basin, in and around the Great Lakes. So data and other relevant information provided for the baseline was largely by Great Lakes Fisheries Commission, Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Industry, Forestry, and partly came from our own Department, Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And we also relied on diversified sources of information, but credible sources, like we use published literature and relevant government website. Now, the methodology on risk assessment. Following the conclusion drawn in Ecological Risk Assessment, the study excludes triploid grass carp from the Economic Risk Assessment and assumes that the arrival of diploid grass carp would take 10 years for the impact to be felt in the area where they are present. So the time period considered for the Socio-Economic Risk Assessment begins in 2023 and are for intervals of 10 years and 40 years, as the study uses 2014 as the base year. As for adjustment method, the study used a net present value method. And in socioeconomic risk assessment like this one, that includes multiple years by projecting future, adjustments are very necessary because future losses are always worth less than current losses. Money today, for example, money today, even in an inflation-free economy, is always worth more than the money obtained in the future because of its earning potential or psychological gratification of having money now or today rather than tomorrow. So in order to discount that future impact, the study performed a 3% rate, discount rate, which is the social discount rate, as identified in the Treasury Board Secretariat framework. For risk assessment, the majority of the information came from Ecological Risk Assessment, and we also followed a DFO framework for Socio-Economic Risk Assessment for AIS to determine the methods for calculating risk. A very important part of the study, assumptions. It is always very important to recognize that the projections of the extent and degree of risk caused by aquatic invasive species are problematic most of the times because scientists rarely find opportunities to predict risk in relatively undisturbed environment. Therefore, what we did since there is no feasible way to separate out the risk being predicted from the presence of grass carp into the Great Lakes from other influences, for example, climate change or urbanization, the study used two scenarios, both with and without the presence of grass carp, holding other variables unchanged. For example, the economy is static and the current management measures are in place and all other things remaining the same. Now the valuation part, the establishment of baseline values for the activities in and around the Great Lakes. I'll spend a couple of slides on that one. First, I'll talk about the commercial fishing part of it. Commercial fishing and associated industries are significant employer, particularly in many smaller Great Lakes communities. It is also a very important source of economic income for many Aboriginal communities in the Great Lakes region. In Canada, on average, 12,600 tons of fish were commercially caught annually from the Great Lakes, generating an estimated market value of $230 million per year. In the U.S., on average, annually 7,800 tons of fish were landed, generating an estimated landed market value, not land market value, of $145 million each year. We do not have enough information to calculate a consumer surplus for commercial fishing, but the study noted that since commercial fishing industry is fairly competitive, because of the presence of close substitute goods, for example, fish from other parts of Canada or meat, the associated consumer surplus could be assumed insignificant. Then comes recreational fishing, which is the biggest sector in both Canada and the U.S. In the Great Lakes. In terms of recreational fishing, the study estimated that the expenditure and consumer surplus on the Canadian side of the Great Lakes is at 471 million, and consumer surplus is 48 million. For the U.S., the expenditure in recreational fishing, which also includes purchases and investments, in the Great Lakes was estimated at 2 billion and consumer surplus at 1 billion. Then comes recreational hunting. Many bird species migrate through and use the Great Lakes. Wetlands of the Great Lakes provide important and productive nursery areas for many bird species, which rely on these habitats for protective structure, hunting grounds, migration stops, and raising offspring. The study estimated economic contribution of recreational hunting activities around the Great Lakes in the U.S. at 30 million per year, of which expenditure accounts for 22 million and consumer surplus accounts for 9 million. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough information to calculate and the expenditure in recreational hunting for the Canadian side of the Great Lakes due to lack of information. Recreational boating. Boating in the Great Lakes provide a lot of activities and enjoyment and supports a number of industries in the Great Lakes region, generating income and jobs, especially in coastal communities. The economic contribution of recreational boating around the Great Lakes are estimated to be 2.3 billion and 4.9 billion per year in Canada and the U.S. respectively. In terms of consumer surplus, we did not have reliable information to accurately estimate consumer surplus. Therefore, the study refrained from using that estimate. Public access beaches are widely distributed among the Great Lakes. The economic contribution is estimated to be 235 million and 1 billion per year for Canada and the U.S. respectively. Wildlife viewing. The Great Lakes watershed includes some of North America's most fascinating wildlife. The economic contribution of bird watching in the U.S. is estimated to be 121 million per year. Again, we do not have enough information for the Canadian side, both for consumer surplus and expenditure. Therefore, in order to ensure credibility of the findings of the study, we refrain from using any numbers for these activities. So this is the quantitative part of the baseline. Now we also discussed the qualitative part of the baseline, which we although could not quantify it, but it is very much worth mentioning because these are invaluable services provided by the Great Lakes. Healthy ecosystem, for example, in the Great Lakes support sustainable industries, local economies, as well as benefit people across Canada and the U.S. The Great Lakes ecosystem contains habitat. I have a slide that briefly captured some of the facts. So again, as I mentioned, it contains 3,500 species of plants, including over 170 fish species and mammal to inhabit the basin. In the Great Lakes Basin, more than 216,000 hectares of coastal wetlands have been identified, of which almost 50% is found in Lake Huron and Lake Michigan sub-basin. Though maintaining this complex ecosystem and biodiversity, the Great Lakes provide invaluable services to society, but we could not quantify it because those are tangible and we do not have enough guidance to determine information to determine the values for those services. The Great Lakes also provide considerable subsistence, social, cultural, and spiritual benefit, as Andreas mentioned before. It influenced and supported the livelihood of regional residents significantly. Currently, there are 75 First Nation communities living along the Great Lakes in Canada, and 27 recognized feral tribes in the U.S. portion of the Great Lakes Basin. Subsistence harvest in the Great Lakes include fishing, hunting, gathering of wildlife, and agriculture. But unfortunately, we do not have enough information to calculate the numbers for the entire Great Lakes Basin. So that's all about the baseline values of the Great Lakes Basin in summary. Now I will focus on the risk assessment part of the presentation. For the study, the socio-economic risk assessment that are only the direct consequences of ecological outcome of the presence of grass carp have been captured. These socio-economic impacts are tied to ecological risk assessment and form the foundation of this risk assessment. Now, in order to set the stage, the study assumed that in the absence of added prevention and protection, grass carp will arrive, establish population, survive, and spread, following the findings of the ecological risk assessment. And based on the findings of the ecological risk assessment, the study also concluded that the presence of grass carp will impact commercial fishing, recreational boating, wildlife watching, recreational hunting, beaches and lakefront activities. Therefore, the next slide will highlight the impact by these sectors. Now, what you see here is the impact of the presence of grass carp on the commercial fishing. And this impact links ecological risk assessment impact and assumed a linearity in terms of impact into socio-economic impact. So I'll focus on commercial fishing first. Now, in order to assess or estimate the impact of the presence of grass carp on commercial fishing, it was necessary to project the expected ecological consequences on native fish species that are commercially fished in the Great Lakes. As you can see in the flowchart, the presence of grass carp will not only increase cost of operation, it will also reduce revenues for commercial fishers. The rationale is that grass carp behavior and food habit will degrade the physical characteristics of aquatic habitats and water quality. So less food habitat or plant abundance, degraded water quality would ultimately adversely affect the commercially targeted fish population, which in turn would reduce the catches of commercially fished species and harvesters' revenue and activities. The decrease in revenue would in turn reduce profit and thereby will create a circular flow of income. Not only that, from a demand perspective, the sector might also be adversely affected because of a reduced quality of native species reflected through the smaller size of targeted fish population. The presence of grass carp, this is the revenue side. On the operational cost side, the operation cost will increase or may increase for the harvesters if they have to travel further to remote sites to catch harvested species, which in turn would reduce their profit and will cause less incentive for the harvesters to fish in the subsequent years, which in turn would reduce their profit further. So this will create another circular flow of income, or flow of impact or risk in the commercial fishing sector. It is also anticipated in the study that all the sectors associated with commercial fishing through backward and forward linkages would be proportionally impacted. For example, food processing sector and export sector. I can give you an example. The detriment, for example, if commercial fishing in the Great Lakes is negatively impacted, it will have a negative impact on processing sector, food processing sector, which is already captured in the study in market value. It will reduce international exports of freshwater fish and fish products. It will increase pressure on freshwater fish species sourced from other jurisdictions in Canada. And to some extent, it will also hamper the competitive behavior or environment in the food sector, in the regional economy and the Canadian economy as a whole, and in the U.S. economy. These impacts that we just discussed, the linearity or the causality that we just discussed, has been translated into the landings or market values, and we try to capture or estimate the value that might be at risk in the commercial fishing sector by these impacts. As you see in the table, The extent of impact on commercial fishing in a specific lake depends on the size and depth of the lake to some extent. This came from Ecological Risk Assessment, and Lake Michigan, Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario are the most likely to experience increasing ecological consequences within 10 years and 40 years from baseline. For example, as Lake Erie is the shallowest lake of all Great Lakes, the impact on native fish species is anticipated to be higher because of more interaction between grass carp and native fish species. Lake Superior remained negligible over time given the low probability of introduction. So using the results or the findings of the Ecological Risk Assessment, the study estimated that the present value of Canada's commercial fishing industry at risk from grass carp presence would be $244 million and $1.3 billion in 2023 and 2063, respectively. In the U.S., these figures would be $102 million and $663 million over the same time period. Here, it should be noted that this doesn't mean that the value will be lost. It simply means that the value will be at risk because this impact would possibly trigger some redistribution effect in terms of production and employment. This is due to the presence of substitute products to freshwater species from the Great Lakes. For example, the higher demand for substitute products for commercial fishing industry will result in higher level of production, value added, and employment in substitute sectors, and lower level of production, value added, and employment in commercial fishing sector as well as complementary sectors. Next, I'll go to recreational fishing. Okay. Yeah. The presence of grass carp will have significant impact on recreational fishing in the Great Lakes. Here, the rationale is that the presence of grass carp would damage the recreational fishing through the expected impact on native fish diversity and population, which I already described in the case of commercial fishing. The reasoning is that if catch rates were reduced by decrease in native fish species and diversity and population, demand for trips would likely decrease, which would in turn lead to a decrease in angling days and hence a decrease in recreational fishing activities in the Great Lakes measured by decrease in the expenditure and consumer surplus. And this linkage and this causality has been translated into the impact, and we try to estimate the impact in recreation fishing for Canadian economy and the U.S. economy. And the study estimated that in 10 years, starting 2023, the total present value of impact of recreational fish expenditures and the consumer surplus would be approximately $345 million, of which $293 million is expenditure and consumer surplus is $52 million. Of the total, Lake Erie accounted for $168 million, followed by Lake Huron with $95 million, Lake Ontario with $81 million. Lake Superior has negligible impact. In 40 years, starting 2023, for Canadian side of the Great Lakes, the total present value of impact on recreational fishing would be at $1.3 billion. Of the total, the present value of impact on Lake Erie would be $1.1 billion, followed by Lake Huron and Lake Ontario. The impact on Lake Superior again is negligible. On the US side of the Great Lakes, the study estimated that in 10 years, starting 2023, the present value of impact of recreational expenditure and consumer surplus at the Great Lakes Basin would be approximately $2.4 billion. In 40 years, starting 2023, the total present value of impact of recreational expenditure and consumer surplus at the Great Lakes Basin would be approximately $14.6 billion. Of the total, Lake Huron accounted for $7.9 billion, followed by Lake Michigan, $3.2 billion, Lake Huron, $2.3 billion, and Lake Ontario, $1.2 billion. Lake Superior is predicted to have negligible impact. Now, similar to recreational commercial fishing, it is also expected that damage to recreational harvested fish species caused by grass carp presence would be followed by some relocation of expenditure of residents and non-residents to other sectors in the economy. These are mainly the quantitative part of risk assessment, socio-economic risk assessment. Now I'll focus on other activities, other sectors, which we qualitatively described, but could not quantify it because those are not linked to the ecological outcome of the ecological risk assessment. First of all, I'll focus on recreational hunting. The presence of grass carp has been documented to be detrimental to bird species habitat because of their destructive nature on wetland plants. Grass carp are consuming submerged aquatic vegetation and competing for food with several bird species, as well as by altering wetland nesting habitat. The removal of macrophytes can result in adverse effects on the ecosystem with a loss of source of forage for birds. The destruction and degradation of habitat, including the coastal and inland wetlands and river corridors that Great Lakes bird species depend on, may present a challenge for survival and subsequently leads some of them towards species at risk. Of the list of bird species that use Great Lakes wetland, 18 bird species would have high impact and 29 bird species would have moderate impact. And this impact came from ecological risk assessment. We simply assumed linearity between ecological impact and socioeconomic impact. This reduction of bird species and the associated consumer hunting, recreational hunting, although it is not quantified, but it is expected that the hunters' consumer surplus and expenditure would be jeopardized to some degree relative to the extent of deterioration of wetland and bird species habitat caused by the destructive nature of grass carp. Recreational boating. It is different from other impacts. It has been inferred that in the study, the presence of grass carp may facilitate recreational boating activities in the Great Lakes to some degree. The rationale is that mariners and boat owners may have to spend less time and money on vegetation controls, as it was initially introduced to in the North America to control vegetation. So it might facilitate recreational boating and related activities. But unfortunately, since recreational boating is not directly linked to ecological consequences, we refrained ourselves from quantifying it. Wildlife viewing, beaches, and lakefront use. Great Lakes, or the presence of grass carp and the presence of grass carp would have impact, again negative impact on these activities, because grass carp would enhance Cladophora build-up capacity in the Great Lakes. It will increase Cladophora-related problems, that problem may pose significant health risk to the Great Lakes user and contribute to a decreased level of activities. For example, wildlife viewing, beaches, and lakefront use. But since these activities are not directly linked to ecological consequences, we simply qualitatively provided a justification for the negative impact. We did not quantify it. Ecosystem service and ecosystem services and non-market values. There are a large number of coastal wetlands throughout the Great Lakes Basin in both the US and Canada that would likely provide accessible spawning, nursery habitat to the suitable tributaries for grass carp, at least 51 Canadian Great Lakes tributaries and 22 in the US. So in terms of damage to ecosystem services, grass carp population have the potential to nearly completely remove aquatic plants, influence macrophyte composition, damage banks, and cause erosion and increased turbidity, resulting in loss of ecosystem services such as nutrient controlling cycle control. The loss of such unique ecosystem and species may represent a loss to residents, especially those living close to such a unique natural resources, and also to people around the world who value them for their own sake of independent of use. It is difficult and time-consuming to quantify the damage to ecosystem services caused by the presence of the grass carp in the entire Great Lakes Basin due to methodological challenges, the lack of appropriate information, and uncertainty around predicting the future risk. But despite the difficulty, study actually tried to link ecological risk assessment findings and tried to understand the impact on ecosystem services and concluded that there may be low to moderate impact on ecosystem services and non-market values in 10 years, starting 2023, and extreme impact in 40 years, starting again in 2023. Now, social and cultural impact. Which is also qualitative, not quantitative, but it includes a linkage or causality like commercial and recreational fishing, because it has linkage with in ecological term, ecological consequences. But due to lack of complete information on subsistence harvest data, we could not quantify it. But here, as you see in the flowchart, grass carp may directly affect the well-being of residents living close to such a unique environment or unique resources who depend on surrounding environment for subsistence, harvest, income generation, and cultural and social identity. Grass carp may significantly damage subsistence harvest from the Great Lakes and reduce the social, cultural, and spiritual values. Subsistence harvest may be impacted due to a couple of reasons. First of all, it can change. It may be impacted due to the change in ecosystem, which may result in less native species, as well as poor food quality for subsistence harvesters, which I explained in the commercial fishing sector. And second reason is gaining access to subsistence fishing may be impaired or may require traveling greater distance, which will increase the cost of our subsistence harvest. It will not only increase the cost or the food source from subsistence harvest. It may also weaken or obsolete traditional knowledge and observation and intergenerational transfer of knowledge and culture and change the ways of life. It may also represent loss or degradation of fisheries and on traditional diet and may threaten food security and health of First Nation communities and individuals. Grass carp presence may also encourage the increased level of competition among subsistence harvesters for fewer native fish species, and it can also increase conflict and competition among subsistence harvesters and recreational anglers and commercial harvesters, if and only if changes causes fewer resource availability. But unfortunately, we do not have the quantified information here. But based on the results or surveys or the results found in the ecological risk assessment, the study inferred that there may be low to moderate impact on subsistence fishing in 10 years, starting 2023, and extreme impact in 40 years, depending on the lake in question. I spoke a lot, so now I will conclude. The socio-economic, a few points about the study, which are also the qualifiers and conclusions. The socio-economic risk reported in the study is providing the best estimates from available research and using the best data available. The risks discussed here are speculative and conservative estimates and anticipated to be by and large proportional to ecological risk assessment reported in ecological risk. The impact of grass carp in Great Lakes would possibly trigger some redistributional effect in terms of production and employment. Just to make sure to the readers that all the risks reported in the study are not lost. It will trigger redistribution. Some sector will expand, some sector will contract. Therefore, from national perspective, it will largely be redistribution of income and expenditure, but there might be some impact, severe impact from regional perspective. It should also be noted that the estimated baseline and risk associated with activities in and around the Great Lakes in Canada and the US should not be directly compared, and also with those provided in extant literature due to methodological differences. The study has some limitations. it used the best available resources and research and data, but it has some limitations which have been mitigated to some extent through application of proxies with adjustment within the limited time constraint. But while the mechanism of grass carp on ecosystem service is still emerging, the study, however, made an effort in identifying the value of certain activities in and around the Great Lakes in Canada and US, and the value of what might potentially be lost or might be redistributed by the presence of grass carp to supplement the ecological risk assessment. And we are hopeful that the study results may be used to communicate to public and resource managers in Canada and the US to help set the priorities for prevention of grass carp. And that marks the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Salim. And I know that Mark Gaiden had a few words he wanted to add just before we get to the question and comment period.
Thank you very much, and I'll be brief because I think we're ready to dive into questions. Salim, thanks for that great overview and all of the great work that you and your colleagues have done on this. The Great Lakes Fishery Commission is strongly supportive of this kind of work because Canada and the United States need good information. The information is directly related to policy and action, as Salim mentioned, on the parts of stakeholders and I'll add policymakers and fishery managers, people who actually need to make decisions about the fishery, the ecosystem, and everything that we value about the Great Lakes. We really respect how Canada approaches the risk assessment process in both ecological and socioeconomic terms. They're two pieces of the important puzzle, and they complement each other. And it should have been very clear that the work that Salim did on the socioeconomic part was based directly on the ecological risk assessment that Becky Cudmore had led a few years ago. This important science is sobering. The ecological risk assessment gave us kind of a sobering account of what is at stake ecologically if grass carp become established. The good news is that although the grass carp have arrived, said that risk assessment, they're not established, and so there's still time to do something. On the socioeconomic part of it, both the economic and the non-economic uses is also sobering, costs in the billions of dollars and extensive harm over the same time period, decades, that the ecological risk assessment covered. So thank you for the work that you do. This work justifies and helps us really communicate the efforts to those who are listening and want to do something. I can tell you in doing legislative affairs for the Great Lakes Fishery Commission that there are a lot of people in both countries who want to do everything possible to keep the grass carp from becoming established in the lakes. And this information gives us much justification for that work. So, Rebecca, back to you, and thanks again. Look forward to hearing what's on people's minds.
I'd like to add here one line. Mark mentioned the work I did. Actually, I should say that I should correct it and to say that what we did, department did in very close collaboration with Great Lakes Fishery Commission and Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm just about to unmute Dave and Becky, who are on the line as well. So they'll be available for questions. And we've had a few that have come in. I think Becky and Dave, you should be unmuted now. You just want to mute yourself. Okay, so the first question we have is, have you or others ever considered impacts to waterfront property values pre and post invasion?
In the case of, I'm answering that for socio-economic perspective, water property values have been from this analysis because just to avoid double counting, because if we actually considered the impact by sectors, economic sectors, for example, we considered commercial fishing, recreational fishing, lake use, beach use, recreational boating, and all those activities. When you take into account, there are two ways to approach this. One is we can either calculate property values or something. Property values has also a linkage to these activities because property values are higher because it has the potentiality that the properties beside those lakes have the potential to use the to be participating in those activities. That is why if we included property values in addition to that, that would have meant that there are some double counting problem in the values. Therefore, we excluded property values but included commercial, recreational boating, wildlife uses, and all the lake shore activities in the study.
Awesome. The next question is, I know you mentioned that Superior isn't included due to the low risk of invasion, but why weren't the present values considered for Lake Superior in the study?
Present value, can you repeat that?
Yep. The question was, I know you mentioned that Superior isn't included due to the low risk of invasion, but why weren't the present values considered for Lake Superior in the study?
Why we included or excluded?
Why we didn't include?
That is because the ecological, first of all, we included Lake Superior in the baseline, but ecological risk assessment predicted no impact of the presence of grass carp in the in Lake Superior. Therefore, that Lake Superior was excluded from the risk assessment part of it. But it is enlisted there just to show that we considered it, but it has no impact. But in the baseline values, Lake Superior is included in commercial fishing, recreational fishing.
Okay. The next question is, your context is the basin. Does that mean you have included values and impacts on tributaries, inland lakes, as well as the Great Lakes proper?
Yes.
I would be interested to know. So,
go ahead. I'm sorry. You should finish the question.
That's okay. It's a two-part question, so if you want to answer that one first, then we can get into the second part.
The lakes covered are largely determined by the results of the ecological risk assessment and partly by data availability. The study in general, especially for commercial and recreational fishing, included the entire Great Lakes system, which includes Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, Lake St. Clair, and St. Lawrence River, and other subbasins.
Okay.
Again, at data, we included that, and but in some cases we didn't have information on all the areas. But for example, in the case of recreational hunting, so in some cases those were excluded, and this is the reason why in the conclusion section we mentioned that one of the reasons why we mentioned that the study results should be assumed conservative estimates.
So the second part of the question is, the asker would be interested to know the values or percentage for the off-lake impacts. So what are the dollar amounts or the cost if you just considered the impacts on the tributary rivers and streams and affected inland waters?
Again, I have to ask you to rephrase it.
So we'd be interested to know the value or percentage for the off-lake impacts. So what are the costs if you just considered the impacts on tributary rivers and streams and affected inland waters instead of the basin as a whole?
Oh, that micro level information is very hard to find in most of the cases. So what we have is data. But the limitation here in the study is that we did not collect data by ourselves. We mainly relied on data that is available out in the published literature. For example, data for commercial fishing came from on the Canadian side came from Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Data for the US side came from Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and recreational fishing came from our own department, Fisheries and Oceans Canada. And data availability actually determined the scope. So that information, that type of detail, we have to rely on data that is not really readily available here.
The next question is, do we know how effective fishing has been in reducing the population of Asian carps close to the Great Lakes?
How expected what?
How effective fishing has been in reducing the population of invasive Asian carps close to the Great Lakes?
I have to defer that to my science colleagues.
Yeah, let me start. This is Mark. There's fishing effort being done in the Chicago area waterway system dealing with the big-headed carp, so the silver and the big-head carp that are downstream of the electrical barrier system. And collectively, and I'll use the royal we here, we've removed probably upwards of 7 tons, I believe, of those fish from the system. That alone won't do the job, but it does reduce the pressure significantly on the electrical barrier system. Regarding grass carp that are in the Great Lakes, presumably mostly in a sterile form, but not always, there is considerable effort going on to do netting and work, particularly in Lake Erie. This is a collective effort that the jurisdictions are doing, so sharing resources across borders to bring all the tools to bear. Part of that is as much an assessment effort to find out where these grass carp are as it is a removal effort. But there's far fewer of the grass carp in say Lake Erie than there are big-headed carps in the Chicago waterways. So obviously the fishing effort is quite different, but it is important.
Awesome, thank you. The next question is, will the results from the Socio-Economic Risk Assessment drive the on-the-water work that DFO and the MNRF are doing to protect the Great Lakes? I'm not sure who wants to take that one. I think Becky and Dave should have audio access now if either of them wanted to take a stab at it.
What is the question again?
Will the results from the risk assessment drive the on-the-water work that DFO and the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry are doing to protect the Great Lakes?
Yeah, I mean, the study, that was the purpose of the study, actually. But the department provided this information along with the Ecological Risk Assessment to provide resource management, resource managers or policymakers in Canada and the United States with relevant information to help facilitate informed decision making. So definitely there will be some impact, but there will be some information that they can use from this study along with ecological risk assessment that will facilitate those activities. Water. Probably Becky can add more to that.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'll let Dave answer this. He's lead for operations for the Asian Carp program.
So we do have extensive work going on in the Great Lakes with our Asian carp early detection surveillance program. And results from this study obviously do support the existing early detection surveillance we have on the go. So we already see Asian carp and grass carp specifically as a threat in Canadian waters. And so this doesn't change our going forward, but it just kind of supports our existing efforts and continued effort to detect grass carp early and remove them from Canadian waters.
Awesome. Thank you. We have time for one more question, and that is, how much greater will the erosive bank and vegetative impacts be compared to existing carp, which I assume refers to common carp?
Sorry. Hey, Rebecca, can you repeat that question?
Yep. The question was, how much greater will the erosive bank and vegetative impacts be compared to existing carp?
The impacts of grass carp.
Yeah, I was going to say the impacts with common carp have been quite extensive, and we've been living with the impacts and loss of wetlands from common carp for over 200 years. This would be what we would consider that this would be a nail in the coffin to the wetlands of around the Great Lakes. This would be another additional invader, having a significant impact on what remaining wetlands we have.
Great. Thank you for the answers to all of our speakers. Thank you for everyone who tuned in today and listened to this webinar. That's all the time we have for questions. So if you have any more, feel free to send me an email and I can try and get them answered for you by any of our speakers. Just another reminder to please fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. We'd really appreciate your input and your feedback. If you're interested in any future webinars, you can visit our website, asiancarp.ca. We actually have one tomorrow if you're interested in registering. It's on Asian carp education, and our speaker is from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters. So again, thank you to our speakers who took the time to present for us today, and thank you to everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.